Well, everybody, John Bornschein here, and this is Cable Lane. Today we're talking about evil. Why is there pain and suffering in the world? And this is an important question for us to examine here today because it's one that's often a stumbling block for those who are considering Christianity or even contemplating the idea of an all-powerful, all-loving God who sits in authority over all that He has created. They struggle with how can you explain evil that exists within this created order? Well, Christianity actually gives us a lot to consider on that subject and answers these questions for us. Sometimes we just have to dig a little deeper and we'll see it for ourselves. That's my hope for you today, is you'll see this with greater clarity and understanding that God does have a plan, even to destroy that which we call evil in the world today. There is a great plan at work. And so let's examine this, because what we need to understand is that to call something evil, we need a contrast to that. That means there has to be something that we deem as good. Well, even C.S. Lewis mentioned in his many writings on the subject, he says, "A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line." In fact, another author adds to this with his profound work, "Can Man Live Without God?" Listen to this. "When you say there's too much evil in this world, you assume there's good. When you assume there's good, you assume there's such a thing as a moral law on the basis of which to differentiate between good and evil. But if you assume a moral law, you must posit a moral law giver. But that's who you're trying to disprove and not prove, because if there's no moral law giver, there's no moral law. If there's no moral law, there's no good. If there's no good, there's no evil." You see, to understand whether there is something called evil, we also must identify that there is something called good. Now, in pantheism, for example, everything is seen as one. Everything is seen as divine. And if that's true, then there's simply no distinction between good and evil, and then everything is morally relative. But deep down inside, we know that that's not right. There has to be an explanation for the problem of evil in the world. Now, my contention to you is that the Bible provides the best explanation for this thing called evil and what is suffering in the world today. Now, depending on one's theological position and presuppositions to this, we will be divided on these matters. Even when we sit down and have a reasonable conversation about this, we can find that we'll come to many conclusions, and it's because we often allow feelings to drive and navigate the conversation. The Bible has a lot to say on this, but let me take you to a few profound authors' writings on this. They have a lot to say on this, and there are many gifted and talented speakers to this subject matter who teach on theology and apologetics. One of those individuals, his name is Ronald Nash. Here's what he says about the problem of evil. He says it is the most serious intellectual obstacle that stands between many people and religious faith. The problem of evil is grounded on the fact that a number of related and essential beliefs about God appear to be incompatible with the evil we encounter in the world. So let's think about just for a moment. I know this might be hard for you, but let's examine what evil is, what we think about when we consider the term for evil. When that word comes to mind, what do you see? Well, it's not hard to imagine. I mean, we simply turn on the news today. We look to media headlines. We look all around us, and it seems like what humans do to each other is often default to what we call in Christendom as a sin nature that acts out in an evil way. It hurts others, and Christians alike will see that people are very good at hurting other people. When you examine the world today, it is filled with hurt people who hurt people. And it only seems to be getting worse and diving further into a world of chaos. And so we have to say, well then, how is that happening? What is going on around us? Well, we know that there's an antagonist out there. His name is Satan, according to the Bible. Goes by many names, but he's often called even the dragon, the deceiver, the liar. But Satan, who also brought with him a third of the angels in heaven, go about antagonizing to bring about evil endeavors. But they're not the source of evil. They certainly try to bring about evil outcomes, But evil seems to exist even within the nature of man, as they are very selfish by default. Now, when we look at this, we still have to give a definition to evil. And what is that? Well, one popular approach to this, one by Augustine, for example, some of our early church writers, Augustine, one of them, he claims that evil is not actually a thing, but a privation. What is a privation? Well, privation is something good that is missing. So almost like a black hole. It's something that was supposed to be there is now absent. One professor of philosophy and religion, he has this to say on the subject. He says, I'm carrying an umbrella on a rainy day. By and large, the umbrella does a good job of keeping the water off of my head. That is good. However, there's a hole in the umbrella. That is evil. For our purposes, the question is, what does this evil consist of? The evil lies, not in the presence of something extra, but in the absence of something that should be there but is not, namely umbrella material. Evil is the absence of good. Philosophers prefer to speak of the privation of good. So what kind of evils exist? Well, indeed, as we look around us, we see that people do evil things to other people, or even to the environment at large, maybe to animal life and all that is created around them. It seems to be a lost cause when we keep trying to legislate morality, because man is not inherently good. To the contrary, actually, we seem to bask in and wallow in more immorality and try to bring more destructive behaviors even through ourselves and into our community at large. Laws and disciplines are interjected into a society to bring a selflessness out of people that they might actually think of the best interest of others, looking out for the interest of others. But alas, we struggle to legislate morality, and even after 330,000 laws in America, we still find that there is evil even within men. And that's because there needs to be a heart that is changed. We have to get to the root of the matter. We can also look at the world around us, and we see within nature that there are animal attacks on people. There are devastating hurricanes and weather patterns, earthquakes and famines and things that create great devastation of life. So there's this toxicity that seems to be brewing all around us as though something is missing. There's a vacuum that's been created, and it seems to be further moving into that vacuum, a void of this thing called good. Now, one day, as we know as Christians, all of that's going to be expelled from the universe. That's our great hope. That not only is there salvation for mankind, that men who are not good can be made good, can be cleansed, made pure, white as snow, but also the world around us will be ultimately healed in a new heaven and a new earth that is formed within the created order of things. But God calls us to examine all of these things, to even examine evil for what it is, and to do so with intellectual truth. We see that in Matthew 22:37-38. So part of the Christian calling is to engage in intellectual conversations, not to avoid them. And certainly the discussion of evil is one of those serious conversations. So let's examine some of the Christian theological perspectives when it comes to understanding why evil exists in the world. Now, one of these is called the free will defense. Christian philosopher Stephen Evans, he describes it like this. The free will defense is the response to the problem of evil, arguing that God may be justified in allowing evil because the possibility of evil is logically inherent in free will. If free will is a great good that makes possible other great goods, then these goods might provide a sufficient reason for God allowing evil. Now, if God, who has created human beings, has also created free will, then God cannot be responsible for the moral evil that human beings freely do, they choose to do to one another. Now listen, in order for there to be love, there has to be a choice. And when we see biblically at the very beginning, God made a choice. He called it the tree of knowledge of good and evil and the tree of life. For there to truly be love in the universe, there must be the freedom to choose that object which is being loved. And we see that within this created order of things, that God has made us to know love, and to love him even though we have not yet seen him. And 1 Peter 1:8 tells us that we believe even without having yet seen his face. We love him without truly being able to behold him. So we love because the gift of choice has been presented in a created universe. And ultimately, at the end of all of the story that God has outlined for us in his holy word, is that which exists in the end will be that which loves him. Those who chose him above all else. There'll be only two paths presented, that into eternal life with him, those who choose him and love him, and those who desire to be away from God, they go to a destination the Bible refers to as hell. Now, in 1940, the book called The Problem of Pain was written by C.S. Lewis, and he discusses the divine omnipotence of God, and he writes, I'm going to submit that not even an omnipotent being could create a society of free souls without at the same time creating a relatively independent and inexorable nature. Freedom of the creature must mean freedom to choose, and choice implies the existence of things to choose between. Now, Norman Geisler, he was a philosopher, theologian, really a defender of the free will perspective, great apologist. He writes this, listen to his words. One of the things that makes men and angels morally perfect is freedom. We have a real choice about what we do. God made us that way so that we could be like him and could love freely. Forced love is not love at all, is it? But in making us that way, he also allowed for the possibility of evil. To be free, we had to have not only the opportunity to choose good, but also the ability to choose evil. That was the risk God knowingly took. That doesn't make him responsible for evil. He created the fact of freedom. We perform the acts of freedom. He made evil possible. We made evil actual. Imperfection came through the abuse of our moral perfection as free creatures. It's hard to add to that. And what we can really deduce from that is that God's sovereignty remains wholly intact, while limited human freedom remains compatible with what God has determined ultimately. Listen to what Ronald Nash has to say on this. Most attempts to answer the inductive problem of evil are variations on one basic theme, namely that God permits evil either to make possible some greater good or to avoid some greater evil. Given the limitations of human knowledge, it is hard to see how any human being could actually know that some particular evil is totally senseless and purposeless. That's right. God works all things to the good of those called according to his purpose. That's the sovereignty of God that we see in Romans 8:28. So let's just talk about this supremacy of God for just a moment. You see, when we talk about that God is sovereign, it means that he rules over all things. Everything that he has created, he alone stands supreme over everything, yes, even over time itself. His holy will cannot be thwarted according to Scripture. We read that in Job 42:2. And he saw all of time before a single day came to be. That is mind-boggling. Isaiah 46:9-10, amongst many others. Listen to this. Remember the former things of old, for I am God, and there is no other. I am God, and there is none like me, declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times things that are not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand, and I will do all my pleasure. Powerful words. You see, God never vacillates between opinions. He is one mind. His mind never is changing. He's never altering his opinion. We see that in Job 23:13. Listen to these few scriptures I want you to hear very clearly about the omnipotence of God, about his sovereignty. Psalm 115:3, we begin our journey here. But our God is in heaven, and he does whatever he pleases. Psalm 135:6, whatever the Lord pleases, he does in heaven and in earth, in the seas and in all the deep places. Proverbs 21:30, there is no wisdom or understanding or counsel against the Lord. Isaiah 46:10, God says, my counsel shall stand and I will do all my good pleasure. Daniel 4:35 says, all the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing. He does according to his will in the army of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth. No one can restrain his hand or say to him, what have you done? And even Ephesians 1:11, he says, all things are according to the counsel of his own will. There are many other scriptures on the sovereignty of God. And what we find in this is there is great peace and solace to know that somebody is ultimately in charge of all of this, and that somebody is good. And yes, he even has a plan for how to eradicate this thing we call evil from all that he has created, the world and the universe and all that's going on in it. The billions of what seem to be isolated circumstances are not functioning after all by random chance. There is a design, there is a designer, there is a purpose, and yes, there is a goal. There's an objective and there is an intention in all of it. Your very breath signifies that you have purpose because God has given you that breath, according to Colossians 1:17. Listen to what we read in Acts 17:27-28. He is not far from each one of us, for in him we live and move and have our being. You see, the scriptures tell us that he knows the thoughts of every single person. Psalm 94:11, Psalm 139, 2-4, amongst many others here on your screen. Now think about that. We just recently passed statistically what they believe numerically the 8 billion number. There are more than 8 billion people now on the face of the earth. Now consider how many thoughts every single person has. I have read between 6,000 to 20,000 thoughts in a day. But let's take the average of 10,000 thoughts for 8 billion people. You can do the math. That means that there are over 80 trillion thoughts every single day. By comparison, Google has 3.5 billion searches in a day. That doesn't even come close to all of the data that God is seeing every single day in his created universe to bring about his glorious purposes. It's mathematically impossible to calculate all of that. The infinite number of circumstances, actions, thoughts, events that exist both in the created order and yes, even within the supernatural world that God has created, all of it under his jurisdiction and authority to bring about his purposes. We just can't conceive of that. The eternal God, he can collate, he can collect, he can bring about perfect harmony in all that he has created, examining everything. And this is just scratching the surface. I mean, even in physics and quantum mechanics, we think about the infinite and how you can bend space and time. You see, time is not superior to God. God exists outside of time. He is atemporal. That means just in the theories in quantum mechanics, you could say that you could spend a million years contemplating a million different decisions and not 1 second go by for you and I. Nothing is impossible for God. Now, God rules over his created order a number of ways. Let's examine at least 2 of those. The first that seems quite extraordinary, and we call them miracles. He is ruling in his created order by way of miracles. In other words, to accomplish his holy purposes, he will interrupt the natural stream of things to do his glorious holy purposes. He has set over all that he has created a natural law over these things, but he has authority even over those things. And so he does these things called miracles. There's no scientific explanation for them. And quite frankly, in science, we can name something and yet still find ourselves in awe of it. That's the right response, because what we find is that we exist in the miraculous. It's all around us. But when we consider things that go without any kind of explanation, such as someone walking on the water, that has no scientific explanation for it, we would call these miracles. And there are at least 37 recorded miracles in the Gospels that Jesus Christ did. But there's at least another 128 in total in the Bible, at least specific recorded miraculous events, not including the book of Revelation. And we read in Psalm 77 verse 14, "You are the God who does wonders. You have declared your strength among the peoples." If we examine just a few of these miraculous events that God does to bring about his holy purposes in the affairs of men, You just think about creation, 6 literal days, that's miraculous. The flood, the plagues of Egypt, the parting of the Red Sea, water flowing from a rock, manna falling from heaven, the sun standing still, or even going backwards. We see the ground open up underneath Korah and close up again. We see the walls of Jericho fall miraculously. We see an axe head that suddenly starts floating to the surface. A chariot carries Elijah up into heavens. That's miraculous. Even at one of the feasts of Belshazzar's feast, we see a hand writing on the wall. There were 3 men who were thrown into a fiery furnace, but they look into the furnace and there's a 4th. They bring them out and they don't even smell like smoke. There's no burns upon them at all. There's a widow who was given a bin of flour that never emptied and a jar of oil that never ran dry in 1 Kings 17:16. We see another widow who started pouring out oil into every single jar she could find within her whole town. And so one jar reproduces into multiple jars. That was miraculous in 2 Kings 4:1-7. We see that Jesus feeds thousands with 5 loaves and 2 fish in Matthew 14:13-21. He does it again with only 7 loaves and a few fish in Matthew 15 verses 32-39. And then 8 people at least are raised from the dead, not including our Lord and all of the saints that were brought back to life after his resurrection. So these are just a few of the ways that God moves in the miraculous. But then there's something happening all around us every single day in this free world environment where we are free to make choices. God still rules over all that he's created by way of providence. It's a term that we don't really find in the Bible. Of course, we don't really find the word Trinity there either, or even the word sovereignty, but the descriptions of these things are throughout the Bible. On one hand, he's interrupting events by way of miracles, and yet on the other side, we see that he's orchestrating within a free will environment all events to a designated outcome. That's because everything is a predetermined outcome by God. Yes, the days that we live and breathe have already been pre-appointed. The dates in which the Lord will come back, all things have been set, boundaries even set for mankind. And to me, that's the greatest wonder of all. The idea of the miraculous, of God directly intervening and doing something supernatural beyond description, that almost seems like the easier miracle when we consider the magnitude of miracles. But to move in every thought, in every decision of a free world environment of both the wicked and the redeemed, still allowing them to have free will and yet working out all things to his glorious purposes. To me, that's one of the greatest miracles of all. The story of Joseph is one such example in which God doesn't do something extraordinarily supernatural, but yet he's still moving in the affairs of men. For example, Joseph, young Joseph, was sold into slavery by his brothers. And we see around the age of 18, just thereafter, he's thrown into prison, comes out of prison around 30 years of age. So we don't know if he was in prison for those full 12 years or not, but he was thrown into prison for a crime he didn't commit after having been sold into slavery by his brothers. Then he's brought into a place of authority in Egypt as second in command that he might save all of the people and yes, even all of the tribes of Israel from a famine. God was moving in all of these details. Listen to this, Genesis 45, 4-8. And Joseph said to his brothers, "Please come near to me." So they came near. Then he said, "I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into Egypt. But now do not therefore be grieved or angry with yourselves, because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. For these 2 years the famine has been in the land, and there are still 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvesting. And God sent me before you to preserve a posterity for you in the earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So now it was not you who sent me here, but God. And he has made me a father to Pharaoh, and Lord of all his house, and a ruler throughout all the land of Egypt." Now listen, the easier thing for God to have done would be to have just picked Joseph up, dropped him by way of cloud into Egypt, done something supernaturally miraculous in front of all the eyes of the people, and just made him the number 2 in all of Egypt, or even made him Pharaoh. But instead, God uses what seemingly are random choices by a whole lot of people, and He orchestrates all of them to His glorious purposes. What seem to be just random choices in a free will environment, God is actively involved even in that. Listen to what Joseph adds, Genesis 50, verse 20. But as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring it about as it is this day, to save many people alive. So innumerable events, circumstances, attitudes that occur within the limited freedom of men and even the demons, this incalculable number that God has created, the mathematical equations that are astronomical, God has pulled it all together, seen every detail, and works it all out to the good of those called according to His purposes. That's why the psalmist says that God has power over all, even in a world where there is evil. He uses all of these things, even the elements, the scriptures tell us. You go back and read Job, 4 chapters, Job 38 to 41, 129 verses talking about the sovereignty of God, that all of nature, everything is under His control. Even the things that are operating in what we deem as evil still will have to answer to the holiness of God. He will not allow anything to go without a verdict. As a holy judge, He will deal with every single evil thought in His created order. So when Job finally hears from the Lord in this, and he is overwhelmed by what God has shared with him, he says in Job 42, verses 1 to 6, then Job answered the Lord and said, I know that you can do everything, and that no purpose of yours can be withheld from you. You asked, who is this who hides counsel without knowledge? Therefore I have uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me, which I did not know. I have heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. Therefore I abhor myself and repent in dust and ashes. See, he had to get a proper understanding of the omnipotence, the omniscience, the sovereignty of God, who is over all things, who has appointed even every single breath of mankind. In Psalm 139:16, we read, your eyes saw my substance being yet unformed, and in your book they all were written, the days fashioned for me when as yet there were none of them. Even in Job 14, verse 5, we read, since his days are determined, the number of his months is with you. You have appointed his limits so that he cannot pass. Listen, God sees all that man does. He knows all that they think. He hears all that they say, according to Psalm 139, verse 4. He uses their good. He uses their bad. He uses the free choices of men, according to Philippians 2:13, and they fit perfectly into His holy, perfect plan. His eternal purposes will come to pass. Even the choices being made by fallen angels, and yes, even by Satan himself, still come under the holy jurisdiction of God. He is not responsible for the evil in their hearts, but God is still sovereignly in control and will steer all things to the outcome of His holy, glorious purposes. So in closing, let's look at these 5 key takeaways. Number 1, evil and suffering really do exist. Ignoring the problem of evil is not a viable solution. Number 2, since He is holy, just, and all-loving, God is not the author of evil. And number 3, God has promised to one day do away with evil forever. Number 4, Christianity offers far better explanations for the reality of evil and pain and suffering than any competing worldviews, including atheism and pantheism. And number 5, we may never understand or be able to explain every single instance of evil and suffering in this world, but because of God's nature, we can trust that there is a greater purpose for every instance of evil that God even allows. We need to hold on to this promise here that God sees all, knows all, and will deal with even every evil word that has been spoken. And in closing, as we examine now Revelation chapter 21, verses 1-4, this is the great hope that we have. He says, "Now I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away. Also there was no more sea. Then I, John, saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from heaven saying, Behold, the tabernacle of God is with men, and he will dwell with them, and they shall be his people. God himself will be with them and be their God. And God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. And there shall be no more death, nor sorrow, nor crying. There shall be no more pain, for the former things have passed away." Brothers and sisters, I hope this has been an encouragement to you, and I'll encourage you to keep going to God's Word to explore this matter to even greater detail. God bless you, my friends. Take care.